Hello and welcome to Faces of the Main Line. My guests today are licensed clinical social worker Lex Remillard and Karen Korfmann, who is a registered nurse and with a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing. Welcome. How are you today?
Good. Well, thank you.
Good.
Thanks for having us.
I guess we'll start with Karen. How did you become interested in the topic of, addiction and rehabilitation, which is what our topic is today?
So my involvement began in an attempt of myself and my family to break silence when my husband of 19 years overdosed in 2017, and he did pass away. He was a mainstream computer software engineer. He worked for several Swiss banks when I met him. He was raised in Switzerland. He then, when we moved here, he worked for a Safeguard Scientifics company in the late 90s, as well as some area private schools. He was really, truly loved. He was an exceptional athlete. He played tennis at our Haverford Tennis Club. And so we had 3 daughters together. It became a well-known loss on the main line. And so my hope is to bring to the community here, to the audience, bring the reality of what does go on along the main line, and what's being kept quiet through shame. And my hope is to open up discussions. My hope is to educate, and my hope is to allow for conversation and allow for people to start stepping forward and getting some education and help. You before I get to Lex, but I want to pursue something you said. It sounds like your husband was a prominent figure on the main line. He was.
Which leads me to the question. There are drug sites that are just open to, everybody knows about them. Everyone knows about Kensington, and everybody knows about a certain part of New York or Boston or California. But the main line, I get the feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like we don't really see that out here. Is that what you're saying?
So what I'm, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, for example, I did a speech recently. I've been bringing awareness to the main line and beyond. Gone to Washington. I've spoken out in support of funds, federal funds for drug addiction, research, as well as education. But when I spoke out at one event, this was a pretty stunning occurrence. A woman came up to me at the end, as people do. They want to bring you their story. And I was in a small circle of people. And she said, I need to say something. And I said, okay. And she said, my husband, and this is a member of, again, a club here on the main line. And she said, my husband died just 2 years ago. This is very close to when my husband passed away. Everybody believes that he passed away from alcoholism because that's what we told people. This is the first time, she said, I'm telling you that it was actually an opioid overdose. So does it happen here? It happens a lot. It happens often. I heard a recent story that was overwhelming to me where a mainline woman fell in the path of a friend of mine's car the other day, and my friend had to actually bring her to her home, and she was disoriented and not well. That's an extreme story. The other stories are behind the closed doors of the safe haven of the family, and they keep it quiet as you do.
Well, just to follow up on that real quickly, we produced a documentary about titled Kensington in Crisis.
Phenomenal.
And one of the people that we interviewed, who she herself was rehabilitating and in recovery, said after she got out of the recovery center that she was in, her mother said to her, "Don't tell anyone that you were in here for drugs. Just say it was alcohol, because my friends won't accept it." So it falls into that line. Now, I don't want to leave you out there alone. So, Lex?
Well, first and foremost, Roger was a dear friend of mine, and I'm here just because I love you. And I met Roger in treatment. I've been in recovery for 20 plus years, and I never thought I was going to get into this field. I didn't have a game plan, and the recovery process led me towards this, to dedicating my life to helping people with substance use disorder. And I lived all over. I moved out here from California in 2007 to start my career. Started working with adolescents and families out in Chester County. And that started the process of learning about this area. And I started to treat, as time has gone on, treat people from the main line all over the place. And the one factor that brings everyone together is the fact that 10 to 15% of the population is vulnerable to addiction. And once the addictive process starts, it can show up in a myriad of different ways. One of the ways is opioid addiction, and there's many ways to get there. But going to the focus of what we're talking about today is how do people in suburban areas end up in a place like Kensington? And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. I've seen a lot of that in the work that I do. A lot of people educated from a world that's far from the rough streets of Kensington find themselves living down there, dying down there. And the question is how does that happen? Yep. So we can talk about that.
How did it start with you?
It started with alcohol, yes. And I'm from a different generation, For most people, it starts with alcohol, and it takes its certain trajectory. When I was growing up, opioids were not available, and they weren't predominant. There was no internet, and it was relegated to certain kinds of people, but it was like this side thing. Nowadays, with the internet and the easy accessibility with cell phones, and you can purchase anything at any time, younger and younger kids have the ability to start with opioids. When I started treating adolescents in Exton, Pennsylvania, I would meet kids, and their first drug they ever took was Oxycontin that they stole from their grandparents. Yep. They just found it, they took it, they were curious, and it set in motion a chain of events that they could not control. And years later, they found themselves in Kensington.
When you said adolescence, what's the youngest that you started to treat people?
Youngest would be 13.
13?
Yep, and she is alive today. And she was using heroin at 13. On basically the end of the main line, yeah.
So you started with alcohol. Was it alcohol because it was like kicks, trendy, or was there an emotional need for it, or was it a combination of both?
No, I would say it was probably cultural, and I was very young, so it was just like something, and I had a different reaction than the other people that I was around. That's the part, people.
That's the scary part, right?
Men and women drink essentially because they like the effects produced by alcohol or other substances. The vulnerability to it is not shown to the person until it starts redirecting their life. And at first, it's very subtle. And at first, substance use gives people something. There's always a payoff in the process. It allows people to deal with their anxiety, their depression. Yep. Maybe it makes them more social, and after a time, it starts taking. And you can't, but by the time you realize something's wrong, it's too late. And then there's denial, then there's rationalization, then there's minimization, and then something needs to stop you. It's either the police, a health situation, or your friends and loved ones coming together and saying, you need help.
I wonder if I might ask just a quick question about this, because you have been treating people along the main line for so long. What about the parent, which, and I've seen this myself before with friends of my own, who say, oh, but we've got means. I can get help for my child. And they're going to do it very quietly. They're not necessarily going to talk about it. They're just going to get their children the best of help. And so, you know, we saw recently Kensington in Crisis, which was just this unbelievably amazing depiction of where your life moves to, and it either ends or you just remain there until something. You might have a loved one come pick you up. So I went a little bit off topic, but what I want to ask you is, we saw faces, these beautiful faces of people in Kensington. And Richie Antipuna, who you interviewed and who lives in Kensington, his words were to the audience, these aren't our kids, these are your kids. Can you tell me, you know, here I am, let's say mainline mom, and I say, no, my kid's never, that's not really my kid. That's a Kensington kid. That they come from somewhere else. So help me understand, if I have means and I can get help for my children, how are they ending up in Kensington? How do I let them? I'm not going to let them go down there. I'm not going to let them do that. How does it go? How can I?
Well, remember, addiction is it's an adaptive process. It's a maladaptive process where the reward system gets hijacked. And once it's hijacked, people will go to any lengths to get what they need.
So what happens?
So you can't stop anyone. Once that starts, it's happening. And they need to be stopped. The problem with the help, and I'm part of it, is that people need to want to get help for it to work. Because you could send someone. I have friends that have been to 20 rehabs, and they keep coming in and out, sober, not sober. Something has to happen within them, and that's something you cannot give them. It comes, they talk about like it's a spiritual change that comes, or it's an incident that happens in their life that shifts their consciousness. But that's a tricky one.
But how, as a mom, when I say I'm never going to let my child go, I'm never letting my kid go down there, how is it that they end up there?
You end up there. Anyone who's down in Kensington did not ever plan to be in Kensington.
Right. They didn't.
You have to think about opioids. It's a system we have that allows us to connect with other people, and it prevents pain, and it's a normal, extremely important system in the body. So when you start taking exogenous opiates that aren't from within, it doesn't even. It changes the person so much that they will go to the source, and they will, to the exclusion of everything else, they'll do that.
So eventually then...
eventually that's where you go.
But eventually then parents finally recognize that they can't, it's beyond their control?
Well, and that's where
and they let go of the...
Well, that's the problem. Love does not help someone with addiction.
My experience in making the film, we were there for 13 months we didn't live there, but we went there over a period of 13-month period. Yeah. And I spoke, and my partner Jill spoke to more women than we did men, or young boys or young guys. And what I found out was that they either grow up in a drug environment where their parents are users. There was a self-esteem issue with girls, whether it's their physical appearance peer pressure from their friends, or what they see in the mirror. Abuse. A lot of the young girls that I talked to were sexually abused by a relative, and the parents ignored it, turned a blind eye. And of course, there was the military. There was a lot of women that we met that I talked to on the street that were in the military, got injured, were provided drugs, and then once they were considered to be okay to go out on their own, Well, they couldn't get any drugs. And so they went up there. They could get what they wanted up there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, one of the things I wanted to ask both of you is how has COVID affected drug addiction? How did people being locked up in their house for 2 years, especially little kids? What happens there?
It's made it much worse because levels of depression and anxiety have gone up because of disconnection between people. So everything has gotten much worse. They didn't stop selling fentanyl down in Kensington during the pandemic, so everything has gotten worse. I've seen more issues now than ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Isolation. A
Isolation.
lot of isolation and non-connection any longer. You can't connect to.
Right. To go back to your
meetings.
point that you brought up, trauma is one of the highlighting factors creating a vulnerability for addiction, any kind of trauma. So whether it's within the family, divorce, rancorous divorce, abuse, neglect, and war, PTSD. So all those factors predominantly push someone towards that to relieve the pain that they have inside.
You know, one of the people that we interviewed, a guy, he said that he was safer on the street than he was in the house with his parents. So he knew that if he stayed in the house with his parents, he could kill himself, or he would get killed. So he went out on the street and eventually ended up in Kensington. And he, of course, was a person we interviewed in recovery. But you think that there's been an uptake, and I think that there's an uptake in girls taking their own lives now, as opposed to, we didn't hear as much of it, but we do now. I meant to ask you and this is a personal question, how did your husband, your former husband, become addicted? Was it physical, mental? Did he do it for kicks? Did you know about it?
So I did not know. I knew that, like many teenagers and college kids, you dabble in things. So I knew that he had, but no, I didn't know the extent to it when we got married at all. But what I will say is absolutely he sought drugs for pain relief. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but it's always about pain relief, whether it's psychological, spiritual, emotional, whatever. So he had pain, and as Lex mentioned, he didn't know that he would, a person doesn't know whether they're going to be, whether it's a gene, whether it's genetic or whatever it is, but some 15 or more % of the people are just going to find out through trying drugs that they are actually they have addiction in within them and in their families.
Were you using drugs with him at the time?
That's so interesting that you would ask. I'm very surprised, and I'm actually really happy that you asked the question. Someone that I know very well, the family, and whose daughter is a very close friend of mine, my daughter. My daughter came home one day and she said, "Mom, my friend so-and-so, her dad said to me, I don't think you should hang around that family too much because she seems like a real happy person and she's happy a lot. That doesn't work for me. There's something about that." And I bet she was probably using too. I have pretty much never done drugs. Have I tried pot when I was 16? Perhaps, and not 16, I think 18 perhaps. But had I been someone who had addiction within me, I would have gone down that path perhaps. But I was the person who in college, we'd be getting ready to go out and people would say, "Oh my God, she's coming. She's going to go at 6, she's going to go home at 10 o'clock anyway." So I just wasn't a partier. I wasn't someone who liked, I had other interests. I was an athlete. So in any event, I got the stigma of you're kind of the prude and we need to leave you at home.
Well,
So unfortunately, not unfortunately, fortunately for myself, I really disliked drugs more than anything. Maybe I was scared of them, I don't know, but I was raised in a family where it was, the word heroin was for junkies. That was a burnout. I didn't know anyone. Where I grew up, I didn't know anyone who used anything like that. Maybe they got high, maybe smoked cigarettes, but in any event. So I was pretty militant on him, and if something didn't feel right in the house, I was kind of all over him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was. Bring him in. Let's go.
How did you find out that he was using? How did you find out?
Well, unfortunately, what ends up happening with someone in my situation, and this kind of, I think, will go back to my question with you, Lex, which certainly happened in my home, and I think this is what happens in families. You start going down a pathway of looking for it. I discovered he was using when it was only a year into our marriage, and we were living in another country, and I said, in this country, they don't even offer AA and Al-Anon and Nar-Anon and things like that. I'm going home. I hope you're coming with me, and I hope you're going into rehab. But if you're not, that's what's happening for me. So it was an accidental. I was a homemaker, and I was doing laundry, and so I found him out. And then from there, it became, unfortunately, until I finally let go of that role, I took on the role of, this is going to stop. You just need to do whatever you're being told to do, and everything's going to be fine. But I took on the role of, if something didn't feel okay, it was, things aren't okay, and I need to start looking, and I need to start figuring things out, and I need to go to the therapist and say, I don't think he's okay. But there's a point at which you recognize you get hurt a lot, not directly, but more or less indirectly, because the drug has an allure that is so captivating for them that they will do anything. And to get the drug wraps its arms around them and doesn't let go, and you can't get in between them. You're here, the drug is here, and there's your loved one, and you're second, you're not first. So at a certain point, you need to recognize that, but you get hurt so many times that you distance yourself, and I certainly tried everything, and at a certain point, I recognized that the only thing I hadn't tried was letting go, and I let go. It was important for me, it was important for him. But I just gave you a lot of information.
No, it's your show.
But in any event, I think that happens in families. My trajectory and our family's trajectory was quite, I think is quite significant and classic, I should say, of the family who finally, they'll do anything for their loved one, for their child, for their friend or relative. But at a certain point, you've been hurt so many times, and the drug, which comes first, second to you, second to their work, second to their higher being, or to God, or church, or spiritual outlets, everything is secondary. And so eventually, over years, you distance yourself, and you understand that you're not in control. The drug is, and the person is. And so they make their way to Kensington.
I want to ask you, thank you.
You're welcome.
But I want to ask you about something else, and one of you can answer it. Recently, and we live on the suburban main line of Philadelphia, so those of you watching it outside of Philadelphia will understand will understand or can understand what I'm referring to, which is Wayne, Pennsylvania. I think the new drug of interest is kratom, Delta 8. It's legal. It's coming from somewhere. The Middle East. I don't want to.
It's from Thailand.
I'm sorry?
Thailand.
Thailand. Okay.
Southeast Asia.
And it's addictive. There's a law firm, and I'm not going to call their name, that represented a family in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and who lost their 26-year-old son because of kratom. A store has attempted to open up on the main line of Philadelphia in Wayne, Pennsylvania. What can you tell me about kratom? And I don't want to get into all that they didn't get the licenses and all that other stuff, because that's not part of our conversation today.
Okay.
But let's talk about kratom.
So kratom it's a plant. It's in the coffee family. It's from Southeast Asia. It's been used for thousands of years in Thailand. A lot of the workers who they make rubber. They cut the rubber trees. They get the sap. They make rubber. A lot of the workers use it. Opiates are used like all over the world to deal with extreme hard labor and dealing with pain. So it's used in that way. And then after the British brought opioids to Southeast Asia, they started to have an opioid problem there in the 1800s, 1900s now. And they started to use kratom to get people off of opiates because it is an opioid. It is not traditional, but it binds the opioid receptor, but to a lesser degree. It's still dangerous, and people would use it to get off of it. I've treated some opioid users who have used that off-label to detox themselves. Now the problem is, it depends on how it's used. I have a couple clients right now who wandered into a store, they got it online, and they got some kratom, and they used it, and kind of like using nicotine, they felt a little different. It was very subtle, and over time they became addicted to it, and it led to fentanyl, and it led to Kensington. So it's a process. Addiction is a process. It's a progressive illness. So because of tolerance, you have to keep upping the ante. And as you know, nicotine is truly a gateway drug, in that it sets the brain up for addictive disorders better than any other drug. Kratom could be that for someone who's vulnerable. And again, when you're little, when you're young, some of the red flags for addiction is age of onset. When did the person start using? So whenever I interview someone that's new in my office, I say, when did you first use this? When did that happen? And because the brain is in development, it's developing the most in adolescence. And when you add a drug to it, it alters the course of their future.
I meant to ask you, and we'll conclude this with part one. I would hope you two would come back for a part two.
Certainly.
Absolutely.
And I didn't ask you how. You said you started with alcohol, but you didn't tell me how you became the licensed social worker.
Yeah.
How you evolved into being
so amazing.
the good guy.
Yeah. Well, as my mother would say, you were a good boy even when you were addicted, which is like partially true. She's a sweet lady. The truth is, the addictive process got into me, and I didn't use opiates till I was 23. So I used opiates predominantly from 23 to 28, and it really took me to the edge of existence. And then I got help serendipitously, and I found myself in treatment. And I was the kind of person, it's funny that I'm a therapist now, because I was the kind of guy that was never going to talk to anyone about anything. It was like, nope, keep it all to yourself. And when you have addictive disorders, you lie to yourself, you lie to everyone else, and you manipulate reality. So part of the recovery process is becoming honest. And when I got into treatment, I became honest because something happened to me where I wanted to change. I wanted to live, I wanted to have a new life, and I didn't want to be enslaved by a chemical anymore. That was my determination. And basically what happened is my life started to grow, and I started to meet different kinds of people, and people that didn't know each other, that weren't in communication, all suggested, oh, you should try this out. You know, you have something and you should go back to school. So and I was not into it. After about 3 years, I started looking into school. I took a psych class. It was interesting, and the rest is history.
So something that is exceptional, you can take one person who overdoses and dies and isn't able to ever give themselves over to recovery. And then you have someone else who grabs hold of it and runs with it and makes recovery their life. It's the person who, Lex told me the story of he met my first husband. He met in at the Karen Foundation, which is recovery. He was there for 60 days, and but Lex said I said, well, how did you end up where? What did you do? And he said, well, I don't know what I did, but I know that I wasn't done with recovery and I wasn't done with myself when I left Karen. And I chose instead to not go home and get my life going again right away. I wasn't ready. He said, I went to the next step and I went to another 6-day therapeutic facility where it's not about addiction per se, it's about trauma. It's about getting at the root cause of why did I ever pick up that drug in the first place? So I don't care whether we talk about eating, not eating, drug use, gambling, any of these things. Everybody has an outlet, everybody needs an outlet, and there's always a root cause. And Lex decided, I need to know what the root cause is. And I personally believe that getting at the root cause can just really make the difference that is absolutely critical in recovery. So
I'm with you.
And with that, it's part one. Lex, you'll be back?
Yes, sir.
Karen?
absolutely.
We'll do part two. This is John Ricciutti from Lower Merion, Main Line, Narberth Public Access Television. And until we meet again, remember, addiction destroys everyone, everything around it. It's a terrible disease.
Yeah.
And the collateral damage is unlimited. Thank you. Until next time.